start in education, in what ways would you say teaching has changed?
I don't really think teaching itself has changed. I think there's a huge amount of accountability now in terms of one's own performance with teaching. But teaching as a teacher has been fundamentally the same throughout history almost. In other words, you're charged to actually skill up that child, to educate that child in order that they become very responsible, responsive, sensitive human beings that can actually play a meaningful part of their societies, the meaningful contribution to their societies. And that, I think, remains constant. I think the role probably of a head teacher has changed over the years.
And what, in October 2008, what would you say are your main challenges as a head teacher here?
Well, I think in terms of Gable Hall, the challenges are to continue to drive for improvement. And depending on how those benchmarks, which actually measure improvement, change, we have to adapt our practices and to adapt our styles accordingly. And that, I think, is the challenge. Previously, when it was 5 A to C's, regardless of English and mathematics, then we were doing exceedingly well. English and mathematics in a community like Thurrock is always going to be more challenging than in other communities. And so we now need to look at that, to consider that particular aspect, that dimension of education, and to adapt our styles and our provision accordingly, so that we again can actually make significant progress in those other two areas, which I believe to be very, very important anyway, and to achieve the pinnacle that we reached previously.
And when, this is my third interview with a different head teacher in the borough, when you all sit around together, is it surprising how different leadership styles there are?
I think invariably styles of leadership will change according to the context. It has to. And no one style is appropriate to all establishments or institutions. And so there is a variety of leadership styles. What I'm particularly impressed with is the willingness now of colleagues to cooperate, to collaborate and work in meaningful partnership. And that's something I think which is relatively new in education globally.
And what about your own style? Would you say that the style at Gable Hall is different from William Edwards?
Not so much now. I think when I first took over William Edwards, it was different because the circumstances of the school at that particular time, and it was in slight difficulties, were different. But I think in terms of what we're trying to achieve as leaders, it remains constant. And that is that my main job is to, first of all, set the vision and hopefully sell what is an impressive vision to my colleagues and to the staff and the parents and the children of the school. Secondly, then, to build capacity within the organisation. And that is one of the major key roles of leadership, is to build capacity amongst one's colleagues. Thirdly, to unblock the blockages. And that's my job, because there are a significant number of blockages that can come about in a school, both internally imposed and externally imposed. And my job is to set about those and see if I can actually release those, and so that my colleagues then can concentrate on what's important and meaningfully teach the children.
What's that mean, unblock the blockages?
It could be government-imposed blockages, it could be local authority blockages that come in for a whole host of reasons. It could be to do with resourcing, it could be to do with demands in terms of criteria that they externally imposed in terms of success. It could be in terms of staffing difficulties, for example. A whole host of different issues can cause a blockage in a school.
And what about your own style as a head? Would you say you run a tight ship, so to speak?
My colleagues would probably argue that I'm not here sufficiently to run a tight ship, and in many respects that's what I like to hear. I think there are three phases that institutions go through, which, if you like, characterise them in terms of the leadership. But one is where the leader is at the centre of the organisation and everything goes through the leader, everything. And in many respects the individual component parts don't necessarily communicate too effectively between each other because they have to go through the leader in order to communicate. So the centre of the universe is the leader. The second stage and the second phase, I think, is where that leader moves to the outside of the ring. In other words, joins the ring, but is also part of that outside. And so it's much more communication biased in terms of we're all listening in on this and we're all having part of it. To what I believe now is the case certainly at Gable Hall and increasingly at William Edwards, where actually I can stand outside the organisation and the organisation is sufficiently mature and the capacity is such that it will continue to run itself very, very well on a day-to-day basis, but much more importantly, actually continue with that development for improvement.
One of the things that colleagues of mine who've seen some of the films that your therapist made is they've seen how dynamic different lessons are in different subjects. Is that would you say, a indicator of way education is delivered in the 21st century?
I think it's much more client orientated. In other words, it's much more about what's the best learning style, rather teaching style, that I can apply within my class which complements the learning styles of the individuals within it. And so the idea of simply chalk and talk has to be a thing of the past. It's much more active learning. And so as my colleagues will probably laugh when talking about this because it's so commonplace these days in school, you have to assess whether a kid is an auditory learner, a kinesthetic learner, or in many respects a passive learner. And having decided on those, you have to then adapt your lesson accordingly. What concerns me in schools, not just in Thurrock but also nationally, is that there is more in-school variation in terms of quality than there is across school. And that, I think, is our biggest challenge. And there are certain key areas within school where the same child is performing so much worse in another subject area. And it's up to us as leaders to really begin addressing those issues within school. And that certainly is the case that's been recognised by the OECD in their report quite recently. And so we need to address, first of all, in-house variation and then out-of-house variation, cross-school variation, within the same context.
You sometimes tire of the superhead tag.
Yeah, I mean, it's a ridiculous title. There's no such thing as a superhead. I think a number of years ago they found that the so-called superheads, the problem associated with them is that they would almost Superman like whiz into an organisation, change everything, it would begin to improve. They then whiz out of that organisation into another one, and what they didn't do, and uniformly did not do, is to build sustainable practice. And that was, if you like, the tag of a superhead. So in other words, when people refer to superheads, I see it as a very much derogatory term, because what they haven't done is to build capacity. I think the issue with headship these days is the fact that increasingly there are younger and younger people being made heads, and rightly so, because we have this dearth of heads, and particularly in the coming years, as you're very much aware, between 40 and 50% of heads are post 50, and there's going to be a massive exodus in terms of people retiring at the same time, and there isn't the capacity below at the moment, and so we're having to look for potential heads at a much earlier stage and bring them on. Now, if that's going to be the case, as sometimes is the case now, if a head is appointed at 32 and they've got another 30 years, are they simply going to do the same job, but the same job in different schools? The answer is no. Because whereas that was the case previously, that once you were a head, it didn't matter how many schools you were a head in, you were still a head doing roughly the same job but in a different school. Now there's different forms of headship. And I think that's something which is really, really welcome.
How is the specialist status working? Is that continuing to flourish?
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. I deliberately chose performing arts at Gable Hall, and I was delighted that William Edwards had chosen sport, because in my view of the two specialisms, subject-related specialisms, those potentially have the greatest impact on the rest of the curriculum. I'm a modern linguist myself, and I find it difficult to see how languages can have as positive an impact on as many subject areas across the curriculum. Whereas sport and performing arts, because what it does for the individual in terms of building their confidence, their self-esteem, in terms of having to project themselves, in having to perform in front of people, and put up with and expect at times failure, and to cope with that failure, but to cope with the enthusiasm that goes with it, in other words the support that goes with it, to be able to coach, to be able to mentor others. I think these are tremendous skills which set you up in life.